So joining you today, our Iqbal Khan, Managing Partner, FAHM Technology Partners. Uh, Iqbal has over 25 years of experience uh, leading various successful businesses globally, including cross-industry technology, education, retail technology, import, export, and renewable energy sectors. Iqbal has served on many boards, including not-for-profit charities and private companies. Uh, Moving on to our IBM speakers for today's webinar, we have Costa Makropoulos. Costa is a senior partner technical specialist for the storage vertical at IBM Canada. He has been with IBM for over 25 years and has spent the last 14 years as a storage architect. His responsibilities include working with customers and business partners to design, size, scope, and implement their storage hardware infrastructure, software, and integrated solutions. He currently maintains the IBM Markham Canada Storage Lab and is focused on data resilience. Joining Costa today from IBM is Reed Sutherland. Reed is a National Threat Management Sales Leader for Cybersecurity at IBM Canada. He has over 30 years of experience and has been with IBM for over 12 years. Reed currently works with clients and business partners across Canada on various IBM security product solutions. Our esteemed speakers today will delve into the nuances of data security and strategy, providing you with actionable insights to transform your approach from vulnerability to resilience. We believe that this discussion will be enlightening and will equip you with the necessary tools to fortify your data and security strategy. We're also excited to announce that that all attendees of this webinar will receive a complimentary cyber resiliency assessment tool from IBM. This tool will provide you with a comprehensive assessment of your current resiliency and offer recommendations for improvement. We will discuss this in detail towards the end of the presentation. And as promised, we will be giving away Amazon gift vouchers worth 100 CAD to 5 lucky attendees who attend the full webinar. We will be taking a snapshot of the attendees and we'll reach out to them directly after the webinar. Once again, thank you again for joining us today. We hope that this webinar will provide you with the valuable insights and practical strategies to enhance your data and security posture. Let's embark on this journey from vulnerability to resilience together. I would now like to invite Iqbal Khan to provide his welcome remarks. Iqbal is the managing partner for FAHM Technology Partners. Iqbal, over to you.
Thank you, Mizan, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. Good afternoon to everybody in the Eastern and Central Standard Time, and good morning to everybody in the Pacific Standard Time. Welcome to FAHM Vulnerability and Resilience, a transformative webinar brought to you by FAHM in collaboration with IBM. I'm Iqbal Khan, the Managing Partner of FAHM Technology Partners, and I'm truly honored to be here before you today as we embark on this journey to revolutionize your data storage and cybersecurity strategies. In an age where information is a livelihood of modern business and the digital landscape continues to evolve at an unprecedented pace, the significance of safeguarding your data and fortifying your cybersecurity measures cannot be overstated. As the custodians of information innovation, FAHM Technology Partners and IBM are committed to helping you navigate this complex terrain. Today's webinar, and more importantly, is not just another event. It's a pivotal moment where we collectively confront vulnerabilities and forge a path towards resilience. We understand that the challenges you face are dynamic, multifaceted, and ever-evolving. Whether it's the threat of cyber attacks, data breaches, or the sheer volume of information that needs to be managed, we are here to equip you with the knowledge and solutions to transform your organization's approach. Throughout this webinar, you will have the privilege of hearing from industry experts, thought leaders, and pioneers who have faced and overcome similar challenges. Together, we will explore cutting-edge technologies, best practices, and innovative strategies that can empower your organization to not just survive, but thrive in the face of adversity. But let me emphasize that this event is not just about theory. It's about practical solutions and actionable insights. We want you to leave this webinar armed with the knowledge and tools necessary to strengthen your data storage and cybersecurity defenses. We aim to empower you to turn vulnerabilities into opportunities for growth and to build a resilient digital future. So without further ado, I invite you to immerse yourselves in the wealth of knowledge and expertise that awaits you in the upcoming sessions. Engage with our speakers towards the end of the meeting, ask questions, and most importantly, take away the valuable insights that will enable you to transform your organization's data storage and cybersecurity strategies. Thank you for joining us in this journey from vulnerability to resilience. Together, we will secure the future of your business in an increasingly interconnected and digital world. Thank you, and back to you, Ms. Ang.
Thank you, Iqbal, and for your valuable insights. I'd like to now invite Costa Makopoulos, our first speaker, to take us through his slides on storage for data resilience. Costa, over to you.
Thanks, Mazan, and thanks, Iqbal and team, for inviting IBM. Please move ahead with the charts. So we're going to take a step back here and talk about the difference between cybersecurity and cyber resilience, because I think it's important to understand this foundational piece. On the one hand, an organization should have both cybersecurity and cyber resiliency. Cybersecurity on the left-hand side here, you see, is all about prevention. It's how do I keep the bad guys out of my environment? And Reid's going to be talking a lot about that side of the house here. Security, locking the doors, how do I prevent people from getting in? Now, on the other hand, cyber resilience is all about what happens when the bad guys get in. I didn't say if the bad guys get in, because what we're seeing increasingly over the past few years, it really is not if, but when. Cybersecurity technologies have gotten a lot better over the years, but we continue to see week over week more and more cyber breaches happening. So the idea of cyber resilience is all about what do I do after the bad guys get in? So for example, how do I respond and recover in the event of some type of breach? Right. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, next chart, please. I think we want to try to start looking at how cyber recovery is different from disaster recovery, right? So it's important to understand that cyber recovery really is an additional capability, and it is different from disaster recovery. When we look at disaster recovery, organizations can recover from a known point in time. They know what data or workload has been impacted, and for rapid recovery, they can have copies of their data at either local metro distances or global distances. With cyber recovery, however, organizations don't know what the recovery point is or when the data first became infected. Since everything's replicated, things like corruption, malware, everything's replicated, all the replicated copies become infected. So essentially what you're looking at, similarly, whether the storage layer or the application layer is affected, organizations don't know how far back the infection is spread. This is the unfortunate reality that we face today. And the crucial part here is the probability of a cyber attack is much higher compared to a disaster. So the need is to be prepared. The financial impact to the business could be very significant. And this is why cyber recovery is required in addition to traditional disaster recovery types of capabilities that organizations may already have. Go ahead and click once here, just to highlight again that the probability of a traditional type of disaster is quite low. The probability of needing to have some type of cyber recovery is quite high. So data resilient solutions really need to cover off both of these spectrums. Go ahead and click next. All right, so when we talk about capabilities to data resilience, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. This is not a one product will be able to solve all of your concerns. We really do see this as a phased approach with different layers. We start out with the foundational layer. Go ahead and click next here. So the first step is really trying to understand, what do you have? How important is it? How do I protect it? When we're looking at these capability steps, IBM likes to use the NIST cybersecurity framework as a benchmark or as a framework to understand what we have. So the NIST cybersecurity framework has 5 pillars. The first being identify, and then detect and protect. So if I don't understand what I have and its importance to my business, and I don't mean how many files do I have, how many servers do I have, how much storage do I have, but really we're looking at the piece of data classification, the risk that's involved, the business impact that's involved, any compliance issues. So understanding from a classification standpoint, you know, what is a minimally viable company? What is required to keep the lights on at my company? What is mission critical from the standpoint of a revenue generating type of workload? And kind of where's the rest of it? You know, I talk to customers every day, and I've got some customers that have 2 levels of data classification. It's called hot or not, right? And then I've got others that take it a little bit more to the extreme, where they have, you know, maybe a dozen different layers of data classification. The idea here is if you don't understand what you have and its importance to the business, it becomes much more difficult to be able to protect and detect and respond and recover in the event of some type of a disaster. So from a foundational standpoint, data classification is really key. You know, secondarily to that, protecting that data is obviously important, and protection from the standpoint of having multiple copies of the data. This is not just limited to, you know, traditional data backup software solutions, but we're talking about full protection, whether that's the disaster recovery use case that we just mentioned before, where you have multiple copies at different locations, although we just mentioned why that's probably not good enough in the event of some type of cyber attack. So data protection is another key tenet as far as a foundational aspect. And how would I be able to detect if anything, any type of breach or any type of anomaly is happening without having the proper cybersecurity pieces in place to prevent, detect, and respond to any type of issue? And that's the piece that Reid is going to be talking about in a little bit. So once we establish that we've got our foundational pieces in place, the next step when we talk about data copies is immutability. So go ahead and click next. So immutability is all about isolating that data. Right? We mentioned before the limitations of using traditional replication type situations where if something is infected on the primary copy, that infection then translates to the replicated copy. The idea here of data isolation, an air gap, whether that be a physical air gap, something like a copy on tape, or a logical air gap with some form of logical immutability. Isolating that data and having multiple points in time copies of that data is important in being able to respond and recover in an effective manner quickly and reliably. If we go to the third stage, go ahead and click next for discovery. It's understanding, what do I have? What's changed? Has anything happened? So IBM has technologies to leverage things like anomaly detection, whether that happens to be on the cybersecurity side of things or on the data resilience side of things, where we leverage things like machine learning to minimize false positives. So you're not constantly being inundated as an administrator, as a cybersecurity team or a SOC with a bunch of false positives where you can't really tell what's real from what's not. So anomaly detection, being able to understand, you know, is something going on and how deep and entrenched is that issue? And then understanding things like data integrity. So on the one hand, you want to have your data isolated and have multiple copies, preferably immutable copies. But what if there was a way that I could leverage those copies in a clean room type environment to be able to run some anomaly scanning, some malware scanning, testing, machine learning type of situations where I can understand how my data integrity is pieced together. So now we've addressed 3 of the 5 phases, right? The initial foundational, the isolation in terms of immutability, and now the data integrity and anomaly detection. So all of this is great, but how does that help me respond and recover? So let's click on the next piece here. So recovery is a very important part in being able to get operations back up and running. Now, how many of you on the webinar today know what the average time it takes to respond and recover from a cyber attack? Right? Now, I'm not sending that out as a poll question, but just to give you guys an idea, the average time it takes to respond and recover from a cyber breach is 23 days, right? That's not an IBM statement, that's an industry-wide statement, right? So if it takes that long to respond and recover, how can I shrink that time? How do I shrink the time it takes to detect a potential issue? And then how do I shrink the time it takes to respond and recover? And then with the capabilities of data classification we talked about in the first phase here, how do I understand what needs to be recovered first and then what can be recovered a little bit later? So this concept or notion of something called a minimally viable company. What are the crown jewels of my organization that need to be up and running first? Right? And then address those and treat that data differently. Treat it differently from a data protection standpoint. Treat it differently from a data isolation standpoint. To be able to say, I want to be able to do things like take an immutable copy on the production storage array for things like fast recovery, short-term retention on the array. I can do that to bring back my minimally viable company. Now, let's face it, I can't do that for all of my data. And for a couple of reasons, one being cost. Obviously, the more copies I keep on production tier 1 storage will cost a lot more. The other is, management of all those copies. So if I do my data classification correctly, where I have what we call the haves and the have-nots, the minimally viable company can be recovered, restored back into production in a matter of minutes and hours rather than days and weeks. The rest of the company, the full company, that can take a little bit longer, right? So now we're talking about putting those immutable copies on off the array, longer term retention on a lower cost type solution. So I see, Mazan, we've got some questions here that have come in. By all means, I can address them. I can address them now if you want to read them out to me.
Sure. We actually had a question coming in saying, how can organizations strike the right balance between prioritizing data's resilience to ensure availability and accessibility and data security to safeguard against unauthorized access and breaches?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it really comes down to that data classification piece and the cybersecurity piece on the left there. So it's you need to understand what you have before you can address how to respond and react to it. It is a fine balance, and you will find probably the hardest thing is to get a bunch of folks in a room to agree on data classification. Right? This is a business decision. This is not something that IT teams should be responsible for figuring out. So we look at, from a business standpoint, is there a CISO involved? What about a risk and compliance officer, a CIO? So the business decisions have to come from top down to understand how the technology can then step in and provide these types of features.
We have 3 more questions actually which have come in right now, but I don't want to disturb your thought of presentation. So I'm probably going to bunch them up together for you towards the end of in the Q&A session, if you like. Yeah. That's
fine. I'm good either way.
Okay, I can ask you right now as well.
Sure.
Whatever you
feel. I mean, if it's on this topic, no problem doing it now. Yeah.
Okay. So in what ways can decentralized storage architectures enhance data resilience by mitigating the impact of targeted attacks or system failures compared to centralized storage models?
Yeah. I mean, there's a fine line between how much consolidation is good versus how good is decentralization. Obviously, all your eggs in one basket is probably not a good idea, right? And we have seen instances where consolidation has been taken too far. Now, I'll put it in this point. You definitely want to segregate out your production data from your backup data and things like that. So that's a given. That's foundational, right? So my production and my backups are on separate devices, but you don't necessarily have to go too far. Cyber resiliency doesn't replace disaster recovery. So obviously you want to have a separate set of data for disaster recovery purposes, not just backup. And then in certain cases, you may want to split out things like development and test environments on their own storage platforms, so that you don't get things like that noisy neighbor environment where some developer is, hitting the storage really hard, and that could have a performance degradation effect on production. That's more from a performance side rather than a resiliency side. But yeah, you definitely don't want to have all your eggs in one basket.
Great. We have 3 more questions coming.
Sure, yeah. It's hard to be interactive on a webinar, but the whole point is to address questions. Absolutely.
Yeah, they're just pouring in. They're just pouring in more and more as we speak. Can you provide examples of past vulnerabilities or incidents and how you address them to enhance resilience?
Yeah, that's a long one. Look, guys, just watch the news. I mean, every week, IBM had our Tech Exchange conference down in Las Vegas last week. If you were watching the news, something happened down there to one of the property owners. Every week, honestly, there's been cases where breaches have occurred, and then you're starting to notice that these companies are coming out early. They're also mentioning how much it actually cost them in terms of the cost of the data breach. And I think Reid's going to touch on this in a little bit. But it really is a combination of both the security pieces of things. How do I keep the bad guys out? And then what am I doing? And this really leads into that next automation piece. What am I doing to respond and recover faster, right? Yes, I have copies of my data, but how do I sift through the dozens or hundreds of copies of my data to ensure which ones are clean and which ones are not? So that's why this anomaly detection we talk about, the data integrity pieces we talk about, and then combine that with automation allows you to be faster to respond and recover, allows you to be quicker to detect these issues.
Great. Sorry, my video. We actually have 4 or 5 more questions.
Okay, maybe for the 4 or 5, we'll
just probably take it, towards the end in a Q&A session.
Sure thing. I mean, really,
questions, guys. Keep
them coming. This is the point, right? I mean, hey, there's over 50 of us on this webinar right now. Thank you for attending, and keep the questions coming. And look, if we can't address them all now, we'll come back to you and we'll address them. But really, what we're talking about here now is how do I wrap this all into a nice little bundle? And that's the automation piece, right? So what if there was a way to create a clean room type environment where I can take these immutable copies that I've been taking and reuse that data to understand and run forensic analysis on it, deep malware scanning, testing. That's great if we're doing one-offs, but when we wrap it around the automation, go ahead, Mizan, and hit enter there. The automation with the orchestration piece, that's the key initiative here, right? How many times have we looked at customer environments or your own environment where you say, hey, I do a once a year DR test, right? That's okay for DR planning if nothing has changed in my environment. But when we start looking at cyber breaches, leveraging these clean room environments where I can run forensic analysis is great, but it could potentially be time consuming if you don't have that orchestration piece or the automation. So, hey, IBM's got ways to integrate our cybersecurity practices and our data resilience practices to say, if I start noticing something on the cybersecurity side, why don't I let my storage team know automatically and maybe proactively take one of those data isolation immutable copies? And on the other way around, if there's something going on in the storage environment, hey, can I send my logs up to the cybersecurity team and get the SOC involved to understand, hey, is something going on in my storage environment? So we're really starting to see this mesh between cybersecurity and data resilience and how they work together, and that orchestration really ties it all together. Mizan, if you click the next button there, you're going to see how this all gets wrapped up one more time. All of these capabilities that we talk about here is something that IBM storage brand calls Storage Defender. It's, holistic visibility, understanding all of the information that I have, all of the data that I have, and being able to protect, detect, respond, and recover in any type of breach. So really, the main question after this is, well, where do I go from here? So go ahead, Mizan. The next step is try to understand what some of your blind spots are. Mazan mentioned at the beginning, everyone that's joined today as a no charge offer is entitled to a cyber resiliency assessment to help understand where your blind spots are, to take a look at those 5 steps and say, hey, where do I fit in that spectrum of 5 steps? Second piece is defend your data. Understand that having copies is one piece of the puzzle, but understanding how clean and how vulnerable those potential copies are is probably even more important, because having a dozen copies doesn't help you respond and recover faster if you have to sift through all of them to see which ones are clean, right? And then the third piece, right? Protecting your data. Protecting your business is understanding, how do I keep the bad guys out, but also how do I respond and recover quickly? Using automation tools, using orchestration tools will help accelerate that recovery. And with that, I think we can pass it over to Reid now to go into more details on the cyber resiliency piece of it, particularly on the security side of things. So Reid, over to you.
Well, thanks, Costa. I knew there was a reason I let you go first. You had to do all the hard work. My part, I'm going to give you practical ideas around how you manage your way through this. And I think that will resonate based on the questions that I've seen. So Mizan, if you could move forward a slide, that'd be great. So we spend a lot of time and money each year going out to hundreds of security people in North America, in fact, globally. And we put together a cost of a data breach report. And we've actually segmented it to show us what's going on in Canada. Mizan, if you move forward, what we're seeing here is that over time, it still takes a significant number of days to identify and contain a data breach. So what this points to is that we have to be prepared in advance for the eventuality that there will be hackers that get into your environment, to know how to find them and how to quickly respond. It's an ongoing art to do so. Mizan, if you could move forward one slide. Now, why is cyber resilience important? Well, you can see that the cost to recover from a ransomware attack that we find from our studies of actual examples is around $5.2 million Canadian. That's a significant amount of money. And what you see is that most organizations will actually pay their attacker. It's still up around 83%. What that tells us is that people don't have their defenses well prepared and their level of confidence in their recovery at a very high state. So lots of organizations are choosing to pay their attackers. Unfortunately, what this means is you're likely to be attacked again. So it's not a good long-term strategy just to pay your attackers in order to recover your data. So the costs of a data breach are listed on the right-hand side. The expenses, what is it doing to you? Is it damaging your brand? Are you subject to class action lawsuits? What do you have to do in order to notify your customers? In Canada, in Quebec, we have Law 25 now, which regulates how an organization needs to respond to its customers in the event of a breach. So it's become increasingly sophisticated and challenging to do the notification process. So these are all things that we would like to avoid if it's at all possible. Mizan, if you could move to the next slide. Now, Costa and I are a match set here. You know, there's a security team and a storage team, and each of us have to do our thing. So I'm on the left-hand side of the equation. What I'm trying to do is detect when you have an attacker in your environment. And then once you've detected that there is an attacker in your environment and that they're trying to move on your data to perhaps impose ransomware, then you have to move quickly in order to respond to that attack and put provisions in place for your recovery. So, you know, time equals damage. So we need to be able to do this in a matter of minutes rather than hours and days. That's always our objective, but it's a shared responsibility between security and the storage team. And often we find in our travels that the security team is not necessarily talking to the IT side of the house, to the storage team, or vice versa. So one thing I would encourage, if you're from the IT side of the house, after today's seminar, reach out to your security team and talk about resilience, talk about what playbooks you have in place in order to respond to an attack. And if you're from the security side of the ledger, then reach out to the IT team that's responsible for storage. So let's get that communication going. Mizan, could you move ahead to the next slide? Now, what we've done with our IBM technology is we've put together the tools that are required to automate all of these processes. So what you're seeing in this picture is on the top left-hand side, you've got a SIM in place, in this case, QRadar. Our QRadar SIM has been a Gartner Magic Quadrant leader for the last 13 years in a row, which is to say we believe that we're pretty good at doing this job. What we're doing is setting up the rules inside your use case that will monitor what's happening in your environment, looking at application logs, looking at what the storage gear is telling us so that we can detect when normal starts going in the direction of abnormal. And we have rules in place to detect that and to discover it. And what we're going to do is determine in conjunction with the storage technology from IBM when you actually have to invoke a recovery. And on the right-hand side at the top of this diagram, you'll see the reference to SOAR. So this is the ability to orchestrate and automate a response to a threat in your environment. And at IBM, we have a product from a company called Resilient that we acquired a number of years back that allowed us to very quickly become top right-hand quadrant capable in the act of orchestration, automation, and recovery. So what I'm going to show you in the subsequent slides is how we actually set this up so that after QRadar detects that a problem exists, that it invokes a playbook within the SOAR technology and actually orchestrates the response to recover your immutable copy. So Mizan, if you could move ahead one slide. We've actually got this set up in a lab so we can do a demonstration and show you exactly how this works. This afternoon, I'm walking you through it. So the first point here is that you've got a database that's in production with mission critical data and an application running on it. And QRadar as a SIM is monitoring what's happening. So the application and the database are sending logs into your SIM saying, here's how I'm doing. Here's how I'm doing. here's how I'm doing. And when the behavior changes, QRadar knows with its rules how to understand that there's a problem. And then what it's doing is invoking the copy service manager using some Ansible scripts, and it's saying you need to start the process of recovering from a copy. And then in the fourth point, what we're doing is validating that what we were able to recover actually loaded and becomes usable, so that you are not reloading corrupted data, but in fact loading a good copy. And then in the fifth stage, what you're doing is putting that onto your flash storage system so that it can be used in production. So we have worked through the integration of the tooling and the configuration of the tooling to put these processes in place to allow you to recover. Mizan, if you could move to the next slide. Now, what we're doing here, unfortunately, it's become a little bit blurry, but we're looking inside of QRadar, inside the SIM, and what you're seeing is a rule that's written up within a use case that actually tells you what criteria need to be met in order to indicate that this is an attack from which you then have to recover. Mizan, if you move ahead to the next slide. So once QRadar as the SIM has determined that there's an attack taking place, it's automatically invoking the playbook within the SOAR, the Orchestration, Automation, and Recovery tool, where you would find a playbook established that has all the tasks laid out in logical sequence that the process needs to follow in order to create a recovery. So Mizan, if you move ahead, this is the playbook that we've developed within our SOAR tool that helps the recovery process get invoked and get tracked and executed through its various tasks. And Mizan, if you move ahead one more slide, what we're able to do inside this playbook, on the right-hand side, you would see that we're invoking the scripting that's required so that the SOAR system using Red Hat Ansible is able to actually reach out to the storage technology, and through this scripting, it's executing the process in order to recover the appropriate volume and restore it into production in order to get you back up and running. Mizan, if you move ahead. So what we've seen is that QRadar has rules inside use cases that are set to specifically monitor the health of the data in your databases and in your applications. And in the event that it detects abnormal behavior, threatening behavior, it invokes the IBM QRadar SOAR tool. That SOAR tool has a playbook already established inside it with tasks that will be executed that contain any code that is required in order to invoke the storage system to go through the process of recovering an immutable copy. So we do both the monitoring and the orchestration to allow you to quickly recover from a ransomware attack. Mizan, if you could move ahead. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mizan and we'll discuss what we can do for you to help you become more enabled and we'll look at the questions in Q&A, and we'll respond to your questions. So, Misan, back to you.
Thank you, Reed. Thank you, Costa. Both of your presentations have been really insightful. As we promised to all the attendees on this webinar, we are going to be reaching out to you with a cyber resiliency assessment tool from IBM, which we're sponsoring, and it's going to be complimentary to you. As next steps, we will set up a call with each and every one of you as a follow-up to discuss this tool and to have a kickoff. So please watch this space for more. We will be reaching out to you shortly after this webinar with setting up some time for this the cyber resiliency assessment tool. We're now going to move into the Q&A session. So before we move into Q&A, just want to show the slide one more time. Kuma, if you go back. In terms of the process and the next steps, so you can see the value add that we have from the CRAT that that IBM is all going to be doing with us for this for all of you. We're going to have a workshop. There are going to be outcomes. There's going to be a lot of engagement as well, and you will be presented with a final report and a presentation. So this is a great value add, and as an attendee of our webinar today, we are providing this to you complimentary. So make sure that you sign up with us and take full advantage of this crack. Moving on to the question and answers. I've seen. Come on, let's move to the question slide. So we actually have a few questions which have already been answered by Costa, and we have a few which have just come in. Because we wanted to end before time. But I'm just going to take a few of them. So the first question, I think, which has just come inside right now, which hasn't been answered already, is, does the application server need authentication? So Reed, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so the application server requiring authentication, I think you're talking about, is it authenticated between the application server and the SIM, between QRadar? Absolutely. There's a secure connection between the application server and the SIM. The application server is sending logs into the SIM, and the SIM is doing analysis. So there's authentication there to protect the integrity of the collection of that security data. And then if you more broadly interpret that question, authentication and dual factor or multi-factor authentication for access to applications is absolutely good hygiene for all of us. So make sure that you use multi-factor authentication for your users in gaining access to data. That will stop a lot of attacks in their tracks. Hopefully that answers the question.
Great. The next question that I have coming in is, how do you prioritize vulnerabilities to address? Are there specific criteria or risk assessments that guide this process?
Yeah, so I'll start on that one. That's a multi-layered question. So in my opinion, you would start first by understanding your crown jewels and knowing what those are worth to your company. Do you have information that absolutely cannot be put out on the web for all people to see? That's the first question you ask of yourself. And if you have data that is a crown jewel, you assess how much is it worth to your organization, and that starts to inform you as to how much money you can spend to protect it. Scanning your data to know where crown jewels exist is a good first step. Once you've identified crown jewels, then you want to put encryption in place to protect that data. And then you want to put the ability to guard access to that data in place. And then you want to send all of that information into your SIM so that it knows when that data comes under attack. Beyond that, you want to assess your vulnerabilities, to find out where are hackers actually finding profitable or feasible entry points into your organization. And this is an area that we call attack surface management, where you would want to look at what does your organization look like to a hacker out on the internet to find, possible vectors for attack. Those are some of the ways in which you would prioritize and defend against threats.
Great. And we're going to take one last question. This is, I'm going to address it to Costa. How can organizations use dynamic threat modeling techniques to anticipate evolving cyber threats and design data storage and security strategies that inherently build resilience against those threats?
Yeah, I mean, that's where we're looking at things like machine learning, entropy detection, anomaly detection. I mean, I like to use the analogy, if people are old enough to remember when radar detectors first came out like 20, 30 years ago, right? And there was this constant battle between the radar detector manufacturers to try and detect radar, and then the law enforcement agencies trying to detect the radar detectors. And then it just kept escalating over and over again to the point where, kind of nobody can win because there's this constant escalating going on. So the idea here is, what tools can I put in place to learn from, not just gather the data, right? So machine learning, it's all about, okay, it's one thing to gather the data and try to have it, another thing to try and understand it. So the machine learning capabilities of our anomaly detection built into the storage array are one key area, and that really helps you detect these types of things faster. So what do I mean by that? Well, data at the end of the day is a bunch of ones and zeros. Right? I'm either reading the ones and zeros or I'm writing to the ones and zeros. Well, if I can understand how those ones and zeros are interacting with my application, I'll give you a perfect example. A cyber attacker trying to encrypt the file system on my data storage, right? What is that? That is a bunch of writes to my system. And when you're encrypting data, or some nefarious character is encrypting data, things like data reduction ratios tend to plummet. So compression, deduplication ratios tend to plummet. Well, at IBM, our storage is smart enough to understand those types of patterns and procedures through machine learning. We could say, hey, this is not right. What's going on here is not normal. So it will flag that information and basically talk to the security team and the security tools and say, hey, I think something's going on this particular volume, which happens to hit this particular server in this particular application. You want to have a look at it and run a scan on it. That's the type of stuff we're working on. And to be frank, we already have at IBM to be able to address some of these concerns.
Great. And, we have time for one more question, which has just come in. Considering the potential threat quantum computing poses to current encryption standards, what strategies can organizations employ to future-proof their data protection mechanisms and maintain resilience in the quantum era?
Yeah, I can address that one too if you want,
Yeah.
Mizan, because that really ties on. Encryption tends to be a storage thing from that standpoint. So the reality is AES 256 is kind of the encryption standard we use today, and we know that it's not easily hacked. However, once you start introducing something like quantum, where you're multiplying your compute resources by orders of magnitude, it very well could be cracked in a matter of potentially minutes, if not hours. So what are the things that we can do? Again, it's all about understanding what are the technologies that are in place today that we can use, and how do I leverage things like machine learning and AI to be able to proactively monitor and understand what's going on. So, this does not replace the need for having copies of your data off the off-premise, off-array, an air-gap type solution. Quantum computing can be great, but if you have a logical or a physical air-gap, I don't care how good the quantum computing is, it can't access it, right? So the air-gap piece is very important, taking copies of that data. You know what, I don't know what the future has to hold for when it comes to data encryption. All I can say is kind of some of the tools we have in place today to address this.
Costa, I'd just like to add one thought to that question. IBM Labs has been all over quantum encryption for quite a period of time. Since we started building prototypes of quantum computers a number of years ago. And what we've done at IBM is we've contributed the quantum encryption standards into open source so that the world can adopt and use new encryption standards for the quantum era. So, in the transition, you're still in a challenging spot because a quantum computer can decrypt current encryption. But rolling forward, you'll see that encryption standards will change and essentially will invoke quantum-proof encryption standards and capabilities in our systems. So don't fear the future.
Love that. And on that note, thank you to Costa, to Reed, to Iqbal for joining us today. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. As promised, we will reach out with setting up some time with all of you for the cyber resiliency assessment tool. And also we will directly reach out to the winners directly after this webinar, after we do a screenshot of all the people who attended right through and through. So stay tuned for more updates from FAHM, and thank you all for the time and for joining us today. It's been a pleasure interacting with all of you, and great questions, by the way. Have a nice day ahead. See ya.
Thank you and take care.
Thanks, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That concludes our webinar for today.